Unfortunately, Rubeena Esmail, the director of our regional program on the prevention of youth violence, can't be with us today. She had to fly back earlier to El Salvador to attend an important meeting there. So she sends her apologies, and she also sent me. My name is Elisabeth Frey. I work in the same regional program on the prevention of youth violence as a component coordinator. I'm responsible for the component on local prevention strategies. I'm based in El Salvador and also responsible for the implementation of the component in Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. So I hope to also give you the answers and inputs you expect. I've been working in El Salvador and in Central America for 3 years now. Before that, I worked for GIZ at that time in Sierra Leone in Western Africa, in the area of decentralized planning and local government. And I'm a political scientist by profession. So I'm really glad to be here, and I really hope to fill this gap and give you the inputs you expect.
So I would say the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Hasenpusch and Mark. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this morning. As has already been said, what we'd like to do today is tell you a little bit about the systemic approach GIZ uses to deal with or to support violence prevention measures in different countries where it works. And what we have today is two examples from the field, which are essentially the two dedicated violence prevention programs that GIZ is supporting internationally. One is in South Africa, where I'm from, and the other one in Central America. So this is the overview of our presentation, just starting briefly with telling you a little bit more about who GIZ is, for those of you who don't know. Just dealing with a few conceptual and definitional issues. Then Elisabeth is going to take you very briefly through the model itself. And then I'm sure what maybe you're more interested in is in practice, how does it look? How are we trying to support our partners in these two different regions to implement the model? And then we'd like to take you through a few of the challenges we're having, and then end off with some conclusions. So just briefly, as has already been said, GIZ is a German acronym, but in English it would be the German Agency for International Cooperation. Some of you might have known it as GTZ before. GIZ now is a combination of three former technical cooperation agencies. And maybe what's important to say as well is that we're responsible for delivering technical cooperation on behalf of the German government rather than the financial cooperation, which is another arm, and which I should say also does quite a lot of work in the area of violence prevention, and particularly urban upgrading. It's a wholly owned enterprise by the Federal Republic. The focus is really sustainable development and international education. Working in 130 countries around the world with about 17,000 employees, and actually more than 60% of those 17,000 are local staff, such as myself, from those countries. The main commissioning partner is the BMZ, the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, and more GIZ is also open to commissions from other German federal ministries and private sector commissioners as well. Just to look very briefly at the portfolio of GIZ in the area of violence prevention, it's in the recent years received increased importance. There's a new strategy paper that has now included violence prevention within the whole realm of peace and security support internationally. It's addressed through different perspectives, and you see some of them there, where either components or violence is included as a cross-cutting theme in those different sectoral areas internationally. But as I said, the two dedicated technical cooperation programs internationally are Prevenir, which is the regional program in Central America, and VCP, which I'll come back to later, which stands for Violence and Crime Prevention Program in South Africa. We thought maybe just very briefly to touch on some conceptual issues. I think we all know in this whole area, we sometimes use we use terminology and words that maybe we understand quite differently in different contexts. So we thought maybe what's important for us to say, just from the perspective of these two example programs, is that really what we're talking about and what we understand our work to be about is safety rather than security as it's defined through other development partners. Having said that, though, Elisabeth can tell you more in a Central American context that the term citizen security is also used and more or less used for the same purpose as safety. And what I think is also very important is we particularly interested in violence prevention rather than crime prevention. So our interventions and the systemic model is really addressing violence specifically. The definition of violence we use, and we found it convenient for across the both programs, is the WHO definition. And within that, specifically, our focus in both of the two programs is interpersonal contact violence between people and what might also be termed community violence. And what is also very key is the focus on primary prevention measures in both of the two programs. Also, sometimes maybe the distinction between primary and secondary prevention can be a little bit blurred in our work, but what we always talk about is primary prevention. And then finally, quite a very strong focus is the idea of promoting co-responsibility for creating safety at local level, and that's between government, civil society, and the private sector. So with those words, I'll hand over to Elisabeth to talk about the systemic approach.
So as Terence just told you, I will go in this third chapter of our presentation a bit more into detail on what we understand as systemic approach to violence prevention. First of all, systemic approach means to us in our development work that we have to work at different levels. At regional level, in the case of regional programs that cooperate with more than one country, at national, provincial, and district level, and this is maybe the most important area of intervention, at municipality and local level. Furthermore, we always try to involve different sectors into violence prevention, the education sector, health, youth, work, security, etc. And we always try to foster cooperation between government, civil society, and private sector. So prevention is a joint undertaking. This may sound simple, but for us, it's maybe the biggest challenge in our work, to really get sectors together, different ministries, to work at different levels, also try to foster cooperation between these levels in highly centralized countries, for example. So I just wanted to mention these 3 points at the beginning because they guide and structure all over our prevention programs. It doesn't matter if it's South Africa or Central America. This multi-sectoral and multi-level perspective is maybe the key factor of this systemic approach. But it also goes a bit further than that. The systemic approach also tries to provide guidelines for actual prevention planning and the establishment of prevention plans, for example, at local level. So in this regard, we try to advise, especially local stakeholders, to base their prevention plans and their preventive activities on 4 principles. First of all, we want them not only to focus on the act of violence, but to see the whole system in which violence occurs, to see the contexts of violence, to have this as a certain mindset to approach the whole topic of prevention. So for example, if children or youth fight on the street and one gets robbed, it's not that just the robbery we're interested in. We want to know who are these kids, where do they come from, Why are they there on the street at this certain time of the day? Do they go to school? Do they have work? How does their families look like? And all these kind of relationships between them and the context they live in. Furthermore, we try to advise them on analyzing risk and prevention factors following the ecological model. I guess you all know it. It's been invented by Bronfenbrenner in the 70s and then promoted by the World Health Organization. For us, it's important because it helps to structure the factors behind violence, not just the act of violence, but to see what is behind this violence and how do factors in one dimension of the ecological model, for example, in the individual dimension, relate to factors in the community or the society dimension. So it's more like, it's more a model to structure the analysis and the actual assessments we do in municipalities. And furthermore, maybe I just add this, the ecological model for us as development projects also help us to make clear what kind of prevention and risk factors we can really influence and which ones not. For example, the program I work in, we mainly try to work on relationship and community risk and prevention factors. We do not, for example, advise national policies that much, and we neither focus on, for example, programs on psychological attention, which would be more an example for the individual dimension. So it also, and this is quite important to us because we have to show impacts to make clear which is where can we act and really generate these impacts. A third aspect I wanted to mention, or I wanted to stress again, is this idea of really making a multi-stakeholder approach work. To really try to get all stakeholders on board, for example, in local prevention councils. And again, it may sound simple, but for us, it's the first thing we have to do if we go into a country and want to do prevention work. We have to see who is doing what, who has what kind of mandates, what kind of roles do they play, and really try to get all the important stakeholders on board. And a fourth aspect I wanted to mention is that the objective of the prevention work we support is to change behaviors of young people on the one hand, but also adults on the other hand. Concerning the latter, we differentiate between so-called key actors, who are persons who have direct influence on young people's lives, for example, parents, teachers, friends, and so-called other significant others having indirect influence, for example, mayors, politicians. And they are not of less importance because they actually have to guarantee rights of young people and also set the policy framework. So we always talk about having a double target group, not only trying to influence behaviors of young people, but also working with adults. That's also why we want to foster intergenerational dialogues, for example, in local prevention councils and youth participation, in the councils, in the decision-making on prevention, but also prevention through youth participation. So these four principles do guide our work and our advisory work, especially at local level, and make this systemic approach not a theory, but really a certain way of planning and implementing prevention interventions. So that was really quickly our approach. Now we want to go into the practical experiences and just start with some data. The table shows the latest available homicide rates per country and per 1,000 people, as well as the absolute numbers. The numbers are maybe not 100% correct, but still we think they give an idea of the dimensions we talk about. So as you can see in the table, Honduras is currently ranked the most violent country in the world, with a homicide rate of 91.6. Followed by El Salvador with 69.2. Guatemala is ranked 8th place with 38.5. South Africa, number 15 with 31.8. And here it's also interesting to see the absolute numbers, which is extremely high in South Africa. Then there's quite a gap, and Nicaragua is on place number 57 with only 13.6. And just to really get you a little bit shocked, we put Germany number 191. It's the total list of 200-something countries with only 0.8. So, of course, these are only homicides. It's just one part of the whole picture. And as I said, maybe the numbers are not totally correct, but still, I mean, that's where we work. That's the situation we have to deal with. And now let's see what we can really do in this kind of context. I also brought some pictures from Central America. These pictures show young men kind of rounded up by a heavily armed policeman. They are maybe members of a youth gang, the so-called Maras. Maybe they are not and just believed to be so because of their tattoos, but it's one of the typical pictures we, for example, see in the newspapers nearly every day, and it's also for the police forces to show their commitment, and how they deal with these kind of situations. This is also another typical picture of El Salvador, and in this case, it's how most of the people in the metropolitan area live. And as you can see, they live beside the railway track because that's public space and nobody can kick them out there. And on the other hand, we also have these kind of neighborhoods. And that's actually not where the really rich people live. It's actually close where I live. So it's some foreigners and maybe a middle upper class. And as you can see, it looks really nice, but on the other hand, also kind of closed. You can see the fences, the barbed wire. And of course, that's a typical sign we all have in our houses because security is provided by private enterprises. And just as a last impression, that's a typical school in El Salvador. And as you can see, there is no security measures. There's no private security man or no policeman in the school. So this just to give you an idea on Central America, on where I work, and on El Salvador especially. So Central America is known as one of the most violent regions worldwide, but statistics are totally unreliable. For example, definitions change, indicators change, legislation changes. That's also why, as Terence mentioned at the beginning, we don't really talk about crime prevention, because what crime is can change 3 times a year. So that's why we talk about violence prevention. Also, the number of policemen, for example, changes, and this also has an influence on the statistics. And most of the statistics focus on homicides. There's little data and also little discussion on other forms of violence, like domestic violence or violence in school, for example. Young men are mainly affected by violence as victims and also perpetrators. And violence in Central America has many roots, and there's still a little reliable investigations on the causes of violence. In our program, we commissioned a study, a systematization of the academic literature from Central America, from the US, and from Europe, because we kind of wanted to find out what do academics think about the causes of violence in Central America and have it in a structured way. And actually, one of the investigators who commissioned with this work, and one was from Guatemala, and the other one is here with us today because he's from the University of Bielefeld. Just a coincidence, but Sebastian Huhn. So I will try to give you a little resume of this of these models of explanation of the violence in Central America. But if you have any questions, he is an expert who can give you also many answers. So In this study, they found out that there are more or less 5 explanation models. So first of all, some authors stress that the violence of today is the result of structural problems that could not be resolved by the armed conflicts. For example, oligarchic structures of power, or the little value of work because of the remittances. You have to know that 1/4 of all Salvadorians live in the US. So there are a lot of remittances coming in, and for many it just doesn't make any sense to work in their home country. I just wanted to say that 1/4 of all Salvadorians worldwide live in the US. They live outside their country. Yeah. And they send a lot of remittances, so there are many areas in El Salvador where it just doesn't make sense to work because people get more money sent by their relatives who live in the US. So work has little value. And some people say, or some authors, some academics say, that this is also a structural problem which can lead to violence. A second model is that says that the violence is actually the violence of the youth gangs, the so-called maras. There are 2 main youth gangs in Central America. Both were originally founded in the USA and brought to El Salvador by immigrants who were deported back to their home countries. And the third model stresses the importance of policies, for example, the anti-Mara legislation or the so-called política de mano dura, which are extremely repressive policies that criminalize young people and actually led more to stigmatization than to violence reduction. And finally, also, the public discourse and the media play an important role in how people react to conflicts and also shape the picture we have on Central America. For example, the photo I showed you, this is how the story the media tells us about violence in Central America. And this picture often forgets that there are big differences between countries. For example, what you've seen in the table, the so-called Northern Triangle of Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, has really high homicide rates compared to Nicaragua, although Nicaragua is the poorest country of the 4, which is also quite interesting. So still one could say violence is one of the main obstacles to development, although there are differences between the countries. So let me just give you some basic data on the program. It's called Prevention of Youth Violence in Central America, Prevenir. Here you can see Central America and 4 countries we work in. Our political counterpart is the Central American Integration System. It's kind of the Central American EU. We are currently in the 2nd phase. Let me just stress that the first phase, or the program was kind of redesigned after the first phase. So all the processes and all the advisory work we're doing right now, we began more or less 1.5 years ago. The program is funded by the governments of Germany, the Netherlands, and Australia. It's a program of technical cooperation, and our main focus is capacity development in the area of primary prevention on youth violence. So our implementation strategy, following the systemic approach, and as I told you, one basic idea is to work on different governance levels. So at regional level, we advise CICA, the Central American Integration System, in its efforts to find common answers to violence prevention and share good practices, for example, develop standards on the Central American level. At national levels, we work with 3 ministries, security, work, and the education ministries, and with the national youth institutes, as well as with the police forces. And in some countries, they are already organized in so-called national prevention cabinets. But still, what we try to do with our work is to really advise them on how to work and how to implement in a decentralized way preventive measures in the municipalities towards a common goal with a common conceptual structure. And as I told you, it's extremely complicated because mandates are not clearly defined, roles are not clearly established, and of course budget questions comes in. So still our main focus is on a so-called intermediate level, somewhere between a district and a municipal level. We try to identify key actors from these 4 sectors: security, youth, work, and education. And we formed so-called teams of intermediaries and think that these people, for example, district officers, also municipal staff or representative of NGOs, can have a key function in trying to bridge this gap between national and municipal level, and also can multiply knowledge and, for example, advise municipal prevention councils. So we don't work directly with municipalities, but try to strengthen this this intermediate level. So the impact we want to generate is to get in these municipal prevention councils established, strengthened, and really make them work. And we want to do this through the training of these, just mentioned, so-called intermediaries. Furthermore, we help to institutionalize prevention councils, to elaborate municipal prevention plans. We have another line of action on community policing, and also the question, how can police forces work together with citizens, work together with local governments, for example, within prevention councils. And we always focus on participation of citizens, of women, of young people, and always with this idea that you have to create certain environments that the young generation and the older generations can work together. Another component focuses on supporting the employability of young people. It's not really an employment promotion part of the program, but for example, young people are trained in how to write their curricula, how to apply to jobs. And the colleagues also try to establish a regional information system for young people, because Central America has really small countries, and sometimes it makes sense to leave home municipalities, go to a bigger city, or even go to another country. And a third component focuses on preventive measures in schools, and also try to link the school and the community and, for example, teachers and families. So this is the structure of the program. 3 components. I'm responsible for the left-hand part, for the governance component, and I have colleagues in the other countries focusing more on employability and prevention in schools. So I want to finish my part with some achievements. Later we'll also talk about the challenges, but let's start with the positive things. And of course, the list is extremely long, and I just selected some from last year in El Salvador. We, together with our counterparts, set up a kind of a national coordination roundtable where the 4 ministries I mentioned, as well as GIZ, we are members of, and we meet more or less once a month and update each of us on what's going on in our institutions, and especially we decide on how we can implement together the program. Furthermore, we developed a training concept for municipal and district personnel, as well as NGO representatives, our intermediaries. We selected municipalities together with the ministries, 20 in El Salvador, and also the people who will be trained or who are already trained, 120. The first training module has been implemented in focal point municipalities, 6 out of 20. We supported the construction of 3 municipal prevention offices by youth from risk communities. It was kind of a learning by doing experience. Young people were trained in how to construct houses, and on municipal ground they constructed little offices, and the municipality on the other hand committed itself to have one personnel on prevention, to found kind of a prevention department inside the municipality, which is important to us because there we know we have the context, we know with whom we can work on prevention. 168 youth have been trained in entrepreneurship and 425 received vocational trainings. And my colleagues from the third component held conferences, regional conferences on how to adapt best practices of prevention in schools, in this case from the United States. So with this I just finish and hand over to Terence. Thank you.
Okay, coming to South Africa now. South Africa has had gone through a bit of a rough time of the last 9 months. The image of the country has really been in the public spotlight internationally. Some of you might have seen the shooting of 34 miners in a platinum mine near Pretoria, actually, in August last year. Then there was a brutal rape and mutilation and murder of a young woman near Cape Town in February this year. Actually, February was a very bad month, and we had the huge story around Oscar Pistorius on Valentine's Day shooting his girlfriend, and then finally a story that also made headlines was an attack by the police on a taxi driver in near Johannesburg. So all of these incidents kind of highlight the context that we live in. It's quite an extreme context. There's always stories about some form of violence happening in the country that make headlines, and what's positive is at least there's generated quite a lot of discussion about the situation in the country and why we are such a violent nation. Elisabeth mentioned the figure of the murder figure earlier. The per population rate is not the highest in the world, but in absolute numbers it's extremely high. It's 4 times the global average, equivalent of about 43 murders a day. Attempted murder is also very high, assault to cause grievous bodily harm also high. What's also particularly and especially shocking about South Africa is extremely high rate of rape and sexual offences, which is really quite a national crisis. And of course, these are just reported rates, and they're notoriously underreported, and aggravated robbery, as you can see. So just to say a couple of words about the context, I mean, the current situation in South Africa comes out of a long history of violence and brutality, and violence being used as a means to an end during colonialism, more recently during apartheid. There's extremely high levels of inequality in South Africa. It's ranked amongst the top in the world. But what more and more people are talking about is that we're actually a violent, tolerant society. It's become normalized to use violence as a means to an end. And some forms of violence are even socially acceptable. That's where the distinction with crime also comes in. Sometimes people see violence and they don't associate it with crime. They almost see it as for managing interpersonal relationships, for example, or in schools or parenting. Also the way people strike, it's become normal to use violence to achieve political ends through striking. And when it comes to gender-based violence and violence against women, we have extremely problematic constructions of masculinity that cross all cultural groups in the country that, frankly, we don't have enough of a national discourse around the causes of violence against women. And that's part of the challenge we have as a program. But in general, what makes the context difficult is that the violence prevention agenda is not really being spoken about enough, especially over the last decade or so. We've regressed, despite quite progressive world-class policies around crime prevention. There's been a regression at least from the government side, in the way we deal with crime and violence in the country towards a much stronger law enforcement approach and heavy-handed approach to crime. And quite frankly, also, what we see is there's quite a public demand for this. People want to see justice being done swiftly and sometimes brutally. There's also been quite a lot of vigilante action. But I think people are starting to realize this isn't leading us anywhere as a country. So that's where our small program comes in. It's a bilateral technical cooperation program. It's different to the Prävention program. It's between the governments of Germany and South Africa. It was negotiated in 2008, and the first phase officially started last year, but actually I can say in terms of full-scale implementation, it started in January this year. So it's a very new program. At least initially, it's quite small, and with the objective to try and build and strengthen a community of practitioners around the topic of safety, community safety, urban safety, and violence prevention. In other words, our key goal is really to push a discussion, an agenda around violence prevention in the country with willing and able partners. In terms of alignment with the government's programs, there's a very strong alignment to one of the outcomes that the current government has set, namely all South Africans are and feel safe. And the political counterpart, as most GIZ programs in countries have a political counterpart, for us, we're currently in the process of concretizing a steering committee for the program, but what's very clear is that it will be attached to a governance perspective within government, with the whole focus being the governance of safety at local level, rather than being drawn into a much more policing approach to the problem. Other kinds of government ministries at national level include the police, but the Social Crime Prevention Division of the Police, the Department of Social Development, the Civilian Secretariat for Oversight of the Police, the Local Government Association of South Africa, and the South African Cities Network are examples of the kinds of partners we'll work with. Just very briefly to go through our approach, essentially it's very much modeled on the global GIZ systemic approach, and designed in that way, looking very much at trying to link different stakeholders across all kinds of sectors and disciplines, from both government, civil society, and also the private sector. There's very deliberately a youth focus, maybe not as much as the Prävention program, but youth are a core constituency of the program, as are women, and addressing the issue of violence against women. Also, primary prevention is key, trying to support the notion in the country that, as is the theme of this conference, prevention is always better. And what also I think makes our program quite unique in the country is very much the focus on local government and local level, and trying to assist municipalities to understand the role they can and should play in creating community safety. And what we also have is more a focus on public spaces rather than private spaces, although the distinction between the two can often be very fine. So just to go through some of the pillars of the program, in the middle is what we're trying to build everything around, is a notion of a community of practitioners from all different sectors and all different levels of society. In the first pillar, I'm sorry, I was told they look more like tin cans, but they're meant to be pillars. There's a whole area of work around fostering exchange and collaboration between these stakeholders. And some of the little boxes you see on the side there, those are examples of the kinds of interventions. One of the things, for example, we want to do is maybe emulate something along the lines of the German Prevention Day in South Africa, to bring all the people who are interested together to have a discussion about collaboration and the real issues we need to be talking about. We're in the process now of setting up an online knowledge sharing platform. What's also very important to us is to assist partners to capture and document and systematize knowledge that is already existing. What's also very important is political awareness, and particularly at local level, working with mayors. That's why the EFOS experience was very interesting for us, how we could maybe emulate something similar. And also working with the private sector to get them to buy into the notion of safety a little bit more beyond the normal dominant model of the private security industry. A second big area is around increasing professional capacities for working on issues of safety across a range of disciplines. For example, we're looking at urban practitioners, urban designers, architects, planners, but also a whole lot of fields in the social work area, psychology, and so on. Wherever we can find entry points, we'd like to support processes like that. Likewise with short courses or summer schools, trying to really stimulate a market for these kinds of professionalization offers in the country. And then the third pillar is really the focus on primary prevention, and particularly working with young people, developing models also for how young people can be a lot more engaged in safety activities in collaboration with municipalities and NGOs and other stakeholders at local level. And one new area we're exploring is the use of new media, such as social media, in trying to make participation in safety issues more attractive to young people. And then the final area is really the work directly with municipalities on helping them mainstream safety and integrate into their integrated development planning and budgeting, performance monitoring processes. We're also working with national stakeholders to integrate safety as a theme into the current national urban development policy process, which is quite exciting for us. And we're also looking at other initiatives with partners to try and stimulate more public discussion around the topic of safety in public spaces. So some achievements so far. They are a little bit modest for the reason that we're a very new program, but what we're already finding is the program is really playing a niche but a very critical role in linking up stakeholders. We've had a number of workshops, engagements, dialogues with the broad range of stakeholders we work with, and what they all say is that they're very happy to have this neutral broker that's bringing them together, people that wouldn't normally come together. As I mentioned, the safety in the urban policy agenda is very important for us, which is really trying to anchor safety as a governance issue in the country, which is a topic that hasn't really been emphasized enough. I mentioned the online sharing and collaboration platform. We also have a partnership with the Wits University, which is part of our professionalization support, where they've integrating safety into an experiential learning program for architects, designers, and urban planners in Port Elizabeth, which is the Nelson Mandela Bay Metropolitan Municipality. We have a project with an NGO there that is looking very promising to get youth as ambassadors for safer communities in a certain part of the metro. I mentioned new media. And what we've also done, which was a major focus of last year's work, was to implement a GIZ instrument, which is a capacity development assessment in one of our municipalities, which is our flagship municipality, which looked to find the entry points for where we could really support and make a difference around the issue of safety in that metropolitan city. The challenges, we've combined both the two contexts, South Africa and Central America, and tried to see what could be cross-cutting challenges between the two contexts and for us as programs working in these contexts. And what we found is that what is really difficult at the moment is a lack of implementation of a strategic approach to violence prevention measures. And there's a number of reasons for this, but in both contexts, what seems to be common is the lack of an appropriate institutional setup within government and society that can foster these kind of collaborative relationships and a more strategic approach. Also, mandates don't seem to be clear within government ministries. Often the issue of safety somehow falls through the cracks because it's everybody's business but nobody's business. So the usual fallback is just the police, which isn't adequate. Political imperatives are also, it's natural that politicians have short-term horizons. They want quick results. They want to be seen to be doing something. They're not really interested in long-term, deep, sustained interventions around prevention. And as I mentioned also from the South African context, but the same in Central America, there are quite embedded social and cultural norms and behaviors that mitigate against a prevention approach. And I could give you some examples from South Africa if we have time. What's also very important, and we've reflected on it, is the talk over the last 2 days at the conference here. A lot has been about evidence-based planning, programming, evaluation, and so on. And this we definitely don't see enough of in our two contexts, and that's an area for us to support. It's also quite difficult, though, in the context of development cooperation programs to find the time and the space to do this kind of very important work, but it is critical. Another key area, especially with our respective focuses on local government, the fact that in these different contexts we have generally unstable and quite weak municipal environments. There's a high turnover of politicians as well as administrators, and it makes working with municipalities quite difficult. Likewise with civil society, in both contexts there is fairly weak civil society in South Africa, which I know better. Historically, we have had quite a strong civil society sector working on prevention issues, but there's definitely been a thinning out of work on that issue as international donors are moving away from South Africa more. But there's also quite a fragmented sector, and that's the contribution programs like ours can do is try to bring together organizations more. And as I mentioned earlier, the private sector, generally there's a lot more that could be leveraged out of the private sector for creating safety and safer public spaces, beyond which is a very vested interest currently in the private sector, private security industry. And then just to end off some conclusions around the systemic approach. From our experience as programs, what we definitely see the benefit of a systemic approach is it allows one to see the whole picture, to analyze all the risk factors, to come up with strategic responses to addressing violence in different countries. It goes without saying that prevention is a cross-cutting issue, and that's definitely what we try to promote as programs. What, though, is definitely an issue and must be understood is it's a long-term intervention, and for development cooperation programs, that often works quite against our logic of usually 3-year phases, maybe a 10-year program horizon that's commissioned between the two countries, and that's something that is quite difficult to work within. Likewise, the issue of measuring impacts of prevention. We've also talked about that over the last 2 days. It's a critical issue, especially for us. We also have to be accountable for how public monies are expended. We need to show impact for our work. But in general, it is a problem of how to measure appropriate indicators and so on, and also how to attribute impacts to certain kinds of interventions or actors and processes. And then a big problem is around, well, not a problem, but an issue we face is around translating good practice knowledge into action. There's so much out there. We've seen it all over at this conference, very useful handbooks and toolkits and so on, but on the ground what we lack sometimes is a little bit deeper than that, to actually understand how to implement these international models, be as good as they are, but how to actually take them and implement them on the ground at a local level, and also to support our partners to understand how to usefully use the material that's out there. And then finally, just a question we've reflected on a little bit is, being here at the German Prevention Day, is how, as international support programs, we can learn more from German experiences. What are appropriate experiences for us to learn and take back to our contexts in the field and expose to our partners and adapt, but equally so that it doesn't just become a one-way exchange. What can we take from where we work as GIZ and bring to Germany, to Europe, to other contexts that can also benefit these countries? So that's it for now. Thank you very much for your attention.
I will thank you for 2 very interesting presentations. And it was one point that I was thinking on, maybe most from Central America, but also from the other. And that is the question of how to convert, particularly in the Maras case, how to convert that activity into political activity. It seems to me so obvious from your first presentation, and also from what I know from other sources, that it's a deep social injustice here. And you can choose many ways to cope with that. You can choose the criminal way. You can choose the more political organizational way. It so happened that I once met a whole bunch of Maras. They were in a prison, and I asked to see them. They were in one room because they had been fighting the other group. But I had several hours of beautiful discussion on other possibilities. And I was struck again and again that this would, some years back, have been an elite group in my country for political drive. So it seems to be so important to not to treat them, not to make their minds sound. They were perfectly all right young people, most of those I talked with, but to get them into seeing themselves as valuable human beings, that could do something of importance to their societies. It is, of course, a problem then that they are so easily identified through their tattooing thing. Mm-hmm. Talked with someone later on, the director of that prison, and I said, I hope this fellow over here soon will come out. And he said he did not hope he came out because he would be killed by the police very soon. So my question to you is, are you able, and in a way it is a thing I have lacked during these days, are you able to politicize the situation of those whose bad behavior you want to prevent?
Do you want me to answer that? Sure. Thank you very much for your question. As we are the State Development Corporation, so maybe we have the advantage that we really work close with ministries and governments. So everything we do, we don't work directly with young people or with members of youth gangs. We always support local institutions and first of all governmental institutions. So what we see at regional level, for example, in Central America, there is really a political will to work prevention. In the framework of a larger security strategy at the level of the Central American integration system, they included prevention as one pillar into their security strategy. So that's for us it's the most important political framework we work in. And also in the several countries, there is a certain will to do something.
It is a problem for them that these Maras probably will turn out at a very radical opposition.
Of course, it's a problem for them, and they realized it, and they want to do something. So that's, for us, the first step. Yeah, they are really interested and working not only on repressive measures, but also on prevention. The problem maybe is that it's difficult for governments to, first of all, to get clear who should do what. Who has the mandate to do prevention? Is it the security ministry? Is it the justice ministry? Or is it the education ministry? Who does what? And how can they really do something on the ground? Because as I mentioned, centralized countries, there is not really a provincial or a district structure. And of course, what the municipalities do, it's their decision. And another thing is, maybe you've heard about this recent initiative of the Salvadoran government, or in El Salvador, actually, the two main youth gangs negotiated and came to an agreement to, yeah. I will not comment on it, but still what we see, for example, it's not just violence between youth gangs. This initiative has dropped homicide rates in El Salvador recently in the last months, but still there's a lot of violence. So it's not just the youth gang issue we are focusing on.
Terence, you mentioned that there were social and cultural norms and attitudes that meant that crime prevention approaches weren't so attractive, and I would be interested to hear more about those.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, by that I meant that it's an issue being picked up more and more actually in the media and amongst the academics to look a little bit more critically at our society and whether it even seems like people really want to stop this sort of what has problematically sometimes been called a culture of violence in South Africa. When you look at, and it's really an issue that crosses race and ethnicity in the country, how especially the sort of attitudes towards women, how to use violence to control women in the home and in public, but also just in general, people, you see it in the forms of entertainment people like. People, for example, love this wrestling on TV, this WWF wrestling. Young kids really love it, and parents let the children watch it. And we're not doing enough to educate parents as well about how to instill attitudes about non-violence in the way they bring up children and what they expose the children to. At school, even though corporal punishment is officially banned in schools, the incidents do still take place too regularly. But beyond schools, there's an interesting anecdote that I think last year there was an amendment brought before the Parliament on the National Children's Act that sought to completely outlaw any form of corporal punishment, including in the home. And there was such a big national outcry against this from religious groups, from cultural groups, saying that it's a parent's right to use physical violence to discipline children, that in the end that amendment wasn't pushed through. So it's things like this that are quite problematic in the country, and it shows that we've got a long way to go and there's a lot more work to be done. And there are some quite critical voices within academia and civil society, people who are trying to champion this a change to a culture of non-violence, but it's going against really a long history in the country of brutalization and the use of violence to achieve different ends. So it's beyond what we can do as a development cooperation program, but it's something that we have to bear in mind and see where there are strategic points where we can at least support government and civil society role players to push this agenda much more.
I have one question to Terence and one to Elisabeth. It's both on implementation. During your presentation, you mentioned when it comes to implementation, Terence, 4 pillars, no? And it was in the slide more or less like a circle or so. In the middle of this is the community of practice. So what are now the mechanisms to bring university, youth, municipality, and the 4th pillar together? Are you holding conferences, meetings, seminars? What is now the driving element to combine these 4 different pillars at certain time or in certain ways so that community of practice might happen? And to Elisabeth, the question is, I catch the word intermediaries. I learned that in El Salvador you already trained 120. And that seems to be a prominent group of actors in the implementation of the program. My question is, are you accompanying those 120 once they are trained, what they do? Do you evaluate how they perform? I mean, it's a big group, 120, and I suppose they are acting in the whole country, no? All over. So how do you accompany their work, being maybe the most prominent people you rely on in the implementation of the program? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I obviously didn't explain it well enough, but I think it's really key to the whole rationale of the program. We work at different levels, and that's also very important. We work at a national level with national government, ministries, and civil society organizations. But we also, very importantly, work, and at the moment we only have the resources and capacity to work in 3 pilot municipalities. But we're also trying to work at a provincial level, but on a more specific issue around youth resilience and creating networks and community of practitioners at that level. But at a national level, definitely that's why I said the model of the German Prevention Day is something we and the partners we work with are interested in. We don't currently have any kind of, not exactly with a focus on prevention. There are national conferences and workshops on crime prevention, but we feel there's a gap there, and we are already working with some institutions that, for example, in August there's a conference on a national conference on crime prevention. So we're already seeing if we can maybe piggyback panels around crime prevention onto that conference. So what's also very important is we don't want to reinvent the wheel. If there are existing structures and mechanisms, we want to build on those and support those. At a local level, and at national level, the other very important process is some kind of an online meeting place for practitioners, where it's not the most important thing. The face-to-face contact, especially in a place like South Africa, is much more important. But if there was kind of a virtual home for this community, that would also be very valuable. And at a local level, we also looking at, similar to Central America, within municipalities, what kinds of structures can there be to bring people in contact with each other around safety? There's a national structure that's meant to be rolled out nationally called community safety forums. That's one option, but there's a whole plethora of other things like youth development committees, planning committees, a whole range of options within the participatory architecture at local level to piggyback on. So yeah, we just started, but as I said, it's looking very promising, and people have said that that's the role they want a program like this to play. Is meaningful.
Quick answer. The intermediaries, the 120, were selected last year by their they come from ministries, municipalities, and NGO. And they got selected by their superiors, and they also committed themselves to leave their personnel for 2 years in this whole process. So it just started, and they received the first module of 5 training modules. And the trainings are throughout the whole year. So the idea always is that they come together, receive the training, and then go back to their municipalities and do practical work. So we have contact with them throughout for the trainings, and also do some intermediate meetings and so on. And of course, they have the support of their institutions. That's for us maybe the most important thing. And we develop the trainings and together with local universities and some local think tanks, and they also support these people in their practical work. But still, of course, it's a challenge for us, especially because we are a regional program, to really give support on the ground. And this is only El Salvador. In July, we start the whole process in Honduras, and by the end of the year, hopefully in Guatemala, and next year in Nicaragua. So at the end, we hope to have about 500 people trained, and yeah, let's see.
Okay, thank you again for your time. We have now 1 hour break. You can have lunch here in the hotel, or you go to the hall. There are food stands if you want it a little more quicker. Thank you again for your nice presentation. I always have a lot of questions myself, but we run out of time. And thanks again. And